What I want to demonstrate to you this morning is there have been a lot of claims made for the Book of Mormon, and the question is can we use these claims, or at least use these presuppositions in a witnessing situation to try and demonstrate what I feel is the superiority of the Bible in these areas, and hopefully show the LDS people that really what we have, if you were to technically define the Book of Mormon, is really, it's a 19th century novel. That's really all it is. And some would even say it's not even a good one, okay? But that's a whole nother issue. I'll let Mark Twain deal with that one. But I want to, this is the question that we're asking this morning. Is there a Book of Mormon geography? And where must a Latter-day Saint go to visit the Book of Mormon lands? And many are not aware that there's an in-house controversy on this. The church, the LDS Church, is really very divided on this. You have some in various camps that don't really like the positions of the people in the other camp. And so they have their own internal struggles, just as we find within Christianity. I want to start off with a quote from this gentleman here, and that's Dr. Lewis Midgley. Midgley's been around a long, long time, and he has been involved in LDS apologetics for many, many years. He's a retired BYU political science professor, and he taught at BYU from 1960 to 1996. But he made a very interesting comment that's in the book, Historicity and the Latter-day Saint Scriptures. He said, there is no middle ground on the question of whether the Book of Mormon is an authentic ancient text. On this, but not of course on every issue, we are confronted with an either-or possibility. There is nothing in the Book of Mormon or in Joseph Smith's account of its coming forth that suggests that it should be read as anything other than historical fact. Now, that's a very traditional statement. I've read material from other LDS members, apologists, I guess that would probably be in quotation marks, even from some faithful Latter-day Saints, who feel that that's really not the case for the Book of Mormon, that it offers a very encouraging spiritual message, but we don't have to take all the other information that suggests that it's talking about real people and places. We don't have to take that seriously. But Lou Midgley is not in that camp, and I would also say that LDS apostle Jeffrey R. Holland is not in that camp. Holland made this comment, and this is in the book Christ in the New Covenant, pages 345 and 346. He said, to consider that everything of saving significance in the church stands or falls on the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, and by implication, the prophet Joseph Smith's account of how it came forth, is as sobering as it is true. It is a sudden death proposition. Either the Book of Mormon is what the prophet Joseph said it is, or this church and its founder are false, a deception from the first instance onward. And I'll tell you, this is one of the few times I really do agree with Jeffrey R. Holland on this. I think he's absolutely correct in this assumption, but the problem is, do the facts back up what Mr. Holland is telling us here? And I would say no, the facts do not. Now, what did Joseph Smith actually say about this? Joseph Smith claimed, and this is in Joseph Smith's history, section 1 and verse 34, he, speaking of the angel Moroni that appeared to him in 1823, as he said, the angel Moroni said there was a book deposited written upon gold plates. Gold plates, not Tumbaga plates, not Ziff plates, gold plates, giving an account of the former inhabitants of this continent and the source from whence they sprang. Now that seems that it seems that he's telling us that this is talking about real people, that there's a history behind this book that was written on these gold plates. Joseph Smith also claimed We are informed by these records, and these records in the context refer to the gold plates. We are informed by these records that America in ancient times has been inhabited by two distinct races of people. The first were called Jaredites and came directly from the Tower of Babel. The second race came directly from the city of Jerusalem about 600 years before Christ. They were principally Israelites of the descendants of Joseph. The Jaredites were destroyed about the time that the Israelites came from Jerusalem, who succeeded them in the inheritance of the country. The principal nation of the second race fell in battle towards the close of the 4th century. The remnant are the Indians that now inhabit this country. Now, I don't want to use this presentation to discuss the problems with DNA and things like this, but you can see from what Joseph Smith is saying here that it's pretty cut and dry. The first were called Jaredites. They came directly from the Tower of Babel. We're going way back to Genesis, okay, and they came over here. The second race came directly from the city of Jerusalem, and when they get here, the Jaredites are all gone. They're all dead. So these are the two groups that he is talking about. What's interesting is when you look at the Book of Mormon narrative, and I believe it's 2 Nephi chapter 8, it gives us the impression that the people that come over here are, in fact, the principal people, that there are no indigenous people to greet them when they get over here. They are the only inhabitants, as far as we can understand, if the Book of Mormon is to be believed. Now, I want to show you something, because Eric just talked about a trip to Israel. If you were to take a trip to Israel, and there are certain places that you will probably go on an average trip to Israel. If you want a good trip to Israel, you need to go with Eric, okay? Because Eric will take you to places people normally don't go. And you're going to see some incredible things there. I just put a very short list over here of some of the things that are normally on the average trip to the Holy Land. Of course, you're going to see Jerusalem, Megiddo, the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, Hatzor, the River Jordan, Beth Shean, places like this. These are the basic places that most tours are going to take you. And these are places that are mentioned in the Bible that can be verified today by geographic location. But visiting the Book of Mormon land sites, well, that's not so easy. And it's not that they don't have tours that visit Book of Mormon lands. The problem with these tours is it's a lot of assumption. Now, I want to show you why that is and why there's a problem here. This is a book that was written by Dr. John Lewis Lund. It's Mesoamerica and the Book of Mormon, Is This the Place? On page 9, he makes this very interesting statement. He said, many members of the church are confused about the disagreements over where the primary events of the Book of Mormon took place. This confusion is the result of well-meaning members of the church advocating for 3 different geographical places. And I love this last sentence here. Adding to the confusion are contradictory statements made by some church leaders. Now, you would think these church leaders are put there by God to solve all these contradictions, but yet they're a part of the problem, which I found fascinating that Dr. Lund would admit to this. There was an article in the Mormon Times back in May of 2010 that I, of course, found fascinating. And it was titled, The Fight Over Book of Mormon Geography. And notice the cartoon here. It kind of illustrates what I said earlier, that these groups are not real friendly towards each other when it comes to this issue. I'm not saying that they don't respect each other as fellow members of the church. I'm not trying to suggest that at all. But I have read some pretty scathing comments regarding people in the other camp. And it goes back and forth. And so obviously some people in the church take this very, very seriously. As sometimes in Christian circles you might ask, we kind of get in a huff about some issues, and I have to stand back sometimes and wonder, is this really a hill worth dying on? I mean, do I really need to get into all this and risk my relationship with a fellow brother? Most of the time, no. It's not a salvific issue. And so while we can have fun debating it, is it something that we really need to get into heated arguments over? And many times I would say no. Well, some tend to think that this is one of those that Latter-day Saints should not get in a huff over, even though, as I said, the proponents on both sides can oftentimes be very, very serious about this and be very critical of those who do not agree with them. Now, the three geographical theories, I want to talk about that for a while. First of all, we have what's known as the hemispheric model. Now, these terms do have an amount of importance if we're going to try and understand what the controversy really is. The hemispheric model, as it's understood, claims that the people of the Book of Mormon lived throughout North, Central, and South America, the Western Hemisphere, you might say. Then there's what's known as the limited geography model, or the Mesoamerican model. For a time, it was even known as the limited Tehuantepec model, which that's a mouthful. I can see why they would want to get away from that explanation or definition. But this places the narrow neck of land that's mentioned specifically in the Book of Mormon at the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, with the land northward being central Mexico and the land southward being generally Guatemala and southeastern Mexico. So you can see that there have been people in the church that have taken some time to really study the geography that's mentioned in the Book of Mormon and tried very hard to place it in a real situation here. And there's been books written on this. Whole books have been written about this. Now there's also what's known as the North America or Heartland model. And this is kind of it's kind of had a new resurgence, you might say. It's not that it's a brand new idea, not at all. But the Heartland model places the Book of Mormon lands in a North American setting. And when I say North America, I mean more in the United States area. Not necessarily Canada or anything like that, but more the United States. And so there, again, are very devout Latter-day Saints to hold to these various positions and dismiss the arguments from their fellow members who hold to a different position. Now, I'm going to show you something here. This is a partial itinerary from a local travel agency offering what they call the Ultimate Book of Mormon Tour. And this is an actual brochure that I took. I probably should have more. Well, I don't really need to have more information. I don't think you'd probably be interested in taking it anyway. I would be fascinated to take this and can I ask questions? But let me show you this list. This is what you would these are the places you would visit if you went on this particular tour. But you have to understand, first of all, the people that are putting on this tour believe in the more limited geography theory. So if you were a Latter-day Saint and you want to take a Book of Mormon lands tour, you better be very careful to read the fine print and find out where the people putting on this tour are coming from. Because you could either be going to Central America or you could be going to New York, and there's quite a difference in those tours, okay? So you want to make sure you know where you're heading. And on this particular tour, you would go to Mexico City, which they say are the great ruins of Teotihuacan, and that's verified, that's what they call that. The ruins of Palenque, considered by many as the best in Central America. The ruins of Pomona, found along the Usumacinta River. Now notice, so far, what they've said is really not disputed. It's just how do those places, how do they really come to be known as Book of Mormon places? They're really not saying they are. They're just giving you a description that's really outside of trying to prove the Book of Mormon at this point. You have The ruins of Tikal, probably the most impressive ruins in Central America. And then you're going to go on a boat ride of the Rio Dulce River. Notice the word, candidate for the River Sidon. Not this is the River Sidon, candidate for the River Sidon. So it's only speculation that this boat ride is going to be on the Book of Mormon River Sidon, which is mentioned specifically in the text. Then we're going to go to the Belize border and see some ruins. Okay, fine. There's ruins. I've seen a lot of ruins down in Central America and such. The ruins of Kaminalhuyu, a prime candidate for this first city of Nephi, prime candidate. The ruins of Copan, fabulous set of ruins located in the country of Honduras. Guatemala City, the once vast city of Nephi, is perhaps the city that is buried beneath this capital. And then you have Lake Atitlan, prime candidate for the waters of Mormon. Let me just caution you, if you were to ever book a trip to the Holy Land and the company you're booking with said, we're going to go visit a place that's possibly Jerusalem, don't book, okay? See, this is the whole difference here. They don't know, and at least they're being honest enough to tell potential customers that we're going to go to these areas that are probably going to give you a warm, fuzzy feeling and boost your testimony, but they come short of saying these places are specifically the places that are mentioned in the Book of Mormon. And I can understand wanting to go as a Latter-day Saint to see these places. I know the kind of feeling and experience you have when you go to the Holy Land and you actually stand on the sites and see the sites that Jesus spoke of and others spoke of. I've often kidded about our trip to Jordan and how we were standing on the very site of Beth Peor that's mentioned in the Bible. There's nothing there, and only Christians get excited about standing on a spot where there's nothing there. Well, why? Because we know that that is the spot that the Bible is talking about. And I know that feeling. It's a great feeling, and it's very comforting. And I'm sure a lot of Latter-day Saints, wanting that same kind of feeling that we as Christians want to experience, want to go visit some of these sites. I get that. But there's a big difference between assuming this is the spot, and believe me, when you go on some of these tours to the Holy Land, sometimes you have to assume this is the spot because they don't really know. There's a lot of places that are mentioned in the Bible that have not been verified geographically. We get that. But here's the difference, folks. Even though there's a lot of places mentioned in the Bible that have not been verified archaeologically or geographically, one thing we can have confidence in is all the many that have been. So really what you could say is however many sites have been verified, consider this like a batting average, the Book of Mormon is still batting 0. It's batting 0. Everything is speculation. They don't know for sure. Once you have Lehi leave Jerusalem, at the very beginning of the Book of Mormon story, all geographic locations, the bets are off. We know about Jerusalem for sure. They wouldn't argue against that. But that's the situation that we're dealing with here. Now, there's a man by the name of Rod Meldrum, and Rod Meldrum is the president of FIRM Foundation, F-I-R-M. It stands for Foundation for Indigenous Research and Mormonism. And he's the author of the Book of Mormon in America's Heartland, and he runs a website called the Book of Mormon Evidence.org. All right? And he has trips to Book of Mormon lands. Now, this is where I was telling you, you have to be careful who you book with because it will determine where you're going to end up going. Now, on his trip, this is his itinerary, you're going to go visit the Hill Cumorah near Palmyra, New York, and it's a sacred Book of Mormon site. And of course, if you've ever talked with Latter-day Saints, he's absolutely correct. It is a very sacred site to Latter-day Saints. You have Niagara Falls, what the Mohawk Indians called the narrow neck of land. Now, the Mohawk Indians, they were a great nation, an Indian nation, but really the narrow neck of land, the one that's mentioned in the Book of Mormon, there's a parallel here? See, these are the questions you have to start asking. And then you have day 4, you're going to visit the Johnson Humrick House Museum, and that houses the famous holy stones found in a Hopewell mound near Newark, Ohio, inscribed with ancient writings that demonstrate a North American connection to the Old World. Next, we will visit the Great Circle in Newark, Ohio. This area is the most extensive monumental earthworks in the world built by the Hopewell civilization and dating between 150 BC and 250 AD during the peace following Christ's visit. Now, let me explain that the holy stones that he's talking about, or this Ohio Decalogue stone, that's what it was also known as. I don't have time to go into a whole lot of the detail on that. I don't even think I could treat it as well it probably should be treated. But these are some of the assumptions that are made by people like Rod Meldrum and others that hold on to the same position that he holds. They will look at these places and say, Book of Mormon lands, like the Hopewell Mounds. There's a lot of controversy in this. I remember, I think it was a conference that was held in Salt Lake City years ago, and I can't remember who put it on right now because I've been to so many of these. But there was a person there who was a proponent of Rod Meldrum's position who got up during a Q&A, and it wasn't pretty. He was giving his position, and others in the crowd didn't hold to it, and a lot of them were shouting, it wasn't a real argument or anything, but they were kind of shouting him down, so to speak, that his positions were certainly not accurate and even inferior to the ones that they held. You're going to go see Fort Ancient, and it's described as another hilltop fortress with miles of embankment and trenches. But you see, how do we know these are really Nephite? Well, yeah, there's embankments. We're not doubting that, okay? We're not questioning that at all. But what are the origins of these? And that becomes a very important question. And then on day 7, you're going to visit Zelph's Mound near Griggsville, Illinois. And it's described as a sacred site is where Joseph Smith had a vision of a righteous Lamanite warrior who died in the final struggles between the Nephites and Lamanites. And I want to talk about this a little bit later in the presentation because Zelph does play a rather important part depending on which view you hold as a Latter-day Saint. You're going to go to Montrose, Iowa. Now, I'm mentioning all these places, and you're going, well, that's not really a place I'd probably want to go on a vacation. And again, it's kind of like standing on Beth Peor, all right? It's the feeling you get, that warm, fuzzy feeling. Montrose, Iowa, near Zarahemla. How do we know it's near Zarahemla, the one that's mentioned in Doctrine and Covenants, section 125, verse 3? Big Springs, Missouri, the proposed waters of Mormon, based on location, distance, and description. Notice the proposed waters of Mormon. And then you're going to visit the Valley of Adam-on-Diamond near Gallatin, Missouri. And on this sacred land, the prophet Joseph found the remains of an old Nephite altar near a place called Tower Hill. Now, I want to show you a statement from Orson Pratt. Orson Pratt was a very prominent Mormon apostle in the early years of the LDS Church. He was kind of controversial in and of himself. He and Brigham Young did tend to butt heads every once in a while on some things. But this is what Orson Pratt has to say. He says, about 375 years after the birth of Christ, the Nephites occupying North America, the Lamanites, South America, this would speak more of a hemispheric model here, and wars having existed between them for nearly 50 years, the Lamanites began to overpower the Nephites, and they drove them northward from the narrow neck of land which we call the Isthmus of Darien or the Isthmus of Panama, burning, destroying, and desolating every city, town, and village through which they passed. The Nephites continued to flee before their conquerors until they came into the interior of the state of New York. The great and last battle in which several 100,000 Nephites perished was on the hill Cumorah, the same hill from which the plates were taken by Joseph Smith. So he's giving us some very specific geographic locations here that we can pinpoint. But he's kind of melding into this idea all these stories that are found in the Book of Mormon. But where's the evidence for this? You have to take it really entirely by faith. Now let's get back to this Zelph the White Lamanite story. I've always found this to be fascinating. You'll read about it in History of the Church. This would be the blue set, we call it, the 7-volume set. Volume 2, page 79. First discovered by members of Zion's Camp. Zion's Camp was an expedition of about 150 men that left Kirtland, Ohio, in early May of 1834 to assist the persecuted saints that were living in Missouri at that time. In early June, they came upon several mounds which had been thrown up by the ancient inhabitants of this country, Nephites and Lamanites. The brethren procured a shovel and a hoe, and removing the earth to a depth of about 1 foot, discovered the skeleton of a man, almost entire, and between his ribs the stone point of a Lamanitish arrow, which eventually produced his death. Now, how do they know this is the skeleton of a man and he's been shot by a Lamanite arrow? How do they know all this? Well, the answer is quite simple. Joseph Smith said so. According to History of the Church, Volume 2, page 79, Joseph Smith tells us, the visions of the past being opened to my understanding by the Spirit of the Almighty, I discovered that the person whose skeleton was before us was a white Lamanite. Now, that's kind of important because Lamanites were known to be dark-skinned. Okay, as a result of their unbelief, God cursed them with a dark skin, and that's really how you could identify who was a Lamanite as opposed to a white-skinned Nephite. But he was a white Lamanite, a large, thick-set man, and a man of God. His name was Zelph. He was a warrior and chieftain under the great prophet Onondagas, who was known from the hill Cumorah, or eastern sea, to the Rocky Mountains. From the hill Cumorah, or eastern sea, to the Rocky Mountains. We're talking about one big chunk of land here, all right? The curse was taken from Zelph, or at least in part, and one of his thigh bones was broken by a stone flung from a sling while in battle, years before his death. He was killed in battle by the arrow found among his ribs during the last struggle of the Lamanites and Nephites. Wow, that's quite an insight. But notice, it's all based on what Joseph Smith says. And if you believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet, you're naturally going to assume he's telling you the truth. There doesn't need to be any evidence. No tangible evidence is necessary. You assume he's telling the truth just because of the position that he holds. And I think we would all agree how sad sometimes when talking with many Latter-day Saints that it doesn't matter what the evidence is. It's all about their subjective feelings. That's what tells them that what they believe is true. Now, William J. Hamlin died in 2019. He talks about the Zelph story, but he doesn't seem to buy it. He was a Mormon apologist while he was alive. He wrote articles in defense of the LDS position, and this is taken from a portion of something that he wrote in the Farms Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. Now, Farms was the Foundation for Ancient Research in Mormon Studies. That it doesn't really exist anymore. They changed the name to the Neil Maxwell Institute, where they've actually gotten a lot nicer since doing that, making that transition. When they were Farms, they could really be nasty sometimes. But I don't think that set very well with church headquarters. And so there was some rearrangements that went on and restructured. And so Farms really doesn't exist. But this is the journal that this was in at that time. This is what Hamlin says. The Zelph story is another piece of evidence that is frequently used to associate Joseph Smith with the hemispheric geography model. Now, why would Hamlin care? Because he doesn't hold to that position. He holds to a limited geography theory. And this is one of those areas that I was mentioning that he's going to go after this other position. It is claimed that Joseph Smith had a revelation concerning the discovery of some bones in Illinois during the Zion's Camp March in 1834. It is claimed, I just read from the history of the church, okay? That's where we find this story. However, the version of the story that appeared in the history of the church that I just read, although editorially couched in the first person, does not in fact represent Joseph Smith's own written account of the event. Boy, he's starting to tread on some very thin ice here, because we know that that's true for much of the history of the church, that it was put in first person. So if you're going to open up this can of worms, this potential Pandora's box, be careful, because now the question mark you're going to put on this story can probably be applied to a lot of what we find in the history of the church. And when you have leaders and apologists going to the history of the church to support their positions, you've now undermined a lot of those positions. So this is what the Mormon apologist sometimes has to deal with. And Mr. Hamlin is, I think, stepping into something that he probably needs to be a little bit more careful about. It does not, in fact, represent Joseph Smith's own written account of the event, nor a revelation. Isn't that what it says? Nor was it editorially approved by Joseph Smith. A lot of things weren't editorially approved by Joseph Smith. Rather, it is an editorial compilation by Willard Richards, who, by the way, was a faithful Latter-day Saint and very faithful to Joseph Smith, written in manuscript between 1842 and 1843. Is he trying to imply because it's written late we need to discount it? Because what do you do with the first vision? There was nothing about the first vision near the time it allegedly happened, and the position that the church takes today is from an 1838 account, which would be 18 years after it supposedly happened. So again, is this really a strong argument that he's using? I don't think so. Anyway, he said it was not published until 1846 after the death of Joseph Smith, and so could not have had his final editorial approval. In the printed version, editorial deletions and changes in the original manuscript, which might have represented Joseph Smith's work, were mistakenly ignored. Now again, this is just his opinion. This is his opinion that's being foisted on us at this particular time. But let's look very carefully at what we have regarding this story, because he seems to want to put a huge cloud of doubt regarding this story. Why? Because it tends to support a hemispheric model that Mr. Hamlin does not or did not hold to. First of all, several respected Mormons verify the Zelph story. 6 men wrote diary accounts concerning Zelph. Those would be Wilford Woodruff, who we know would become the 4th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Heber C. Kimball, who was a member of the first presidency under Brigham Young, George A. Smith, Levi Hancock, Moses Martin, and Reuben McBride. 10th President Joseph Fielding Smith said that this revelation, remember, he calls it a revelation, yet Hamlin questions that. If you had the choice between a Mormon apologist and the 10th president of the LDS Church, and you're a Latter-day Saint, which side would you tend to gravitate to? You would go to the leader of the church. He's a general authority. He was a very influential general authority who wrote volumes defending LDS doctrine and history. He was the church historian for about 50 years. So if I was a Latter-day Saint and you gave me a choice between William Hamlin and Joseph Fielding Smith, my faith, I think, would tell me I better go with the general authority. Okay, so this revelation of the prophet in relation to Zelph is something that our modern critics should consider carefully, who claim that the Nephites and Lamanites did not contend in their final struggle in these northern parts of the United States, and that their activities were confined to Central America and perhaps as far north as part of Mexico. What's the argument here? Well, Joseph Fielding Smith, by his writings, tended to hold to the North American Heartland model. And of course, a lot of these BYU guys tend to hold to that Central American theory or the limited geography theory. We also have Wilford Woodruff and Heber C. Kimball. This is what they said. Now remember, their names were mentioned specifically in the history of the church. Wilford Woodruff said, Brother Joseph had a vision, he misspells it, that's no big deal, respecting the person He said he was a white Lamanite and his name was Zelph. So Woodruff is attributing this story to the Mormon prophet himself, Joseph Smith. Heber C. Kimball said, while on our way, we felt anxious to know who the person was who had been killed by that arrow. It was made known to Joseph that he had been an officer who fell in battle in the last destruction among the Lamanites, and his name was Zelph. This caused us to rejoice much, to think that God was so mindful of us as to show these things to his servant. Sounds like it's a revelatory discussion that's going on here. Brother Joseph had inquired of the Lord, and it was made known in a vision. It was known to him in a vision. So here are some very respected leaders in the church verifying what Joseph Smith claims in the history of the church. But yet you have an LDS apologist trying to cast doubt on what these men were saying. Now, when speaking of geography, let's talk about the Garden of Eden. Now, the Garden of Eden isn't, as far as I know, I don't think it's even mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Neither is the Garden of Gethsemane, by the way. But James Talmage said, though there is no uniform belief among Christian scholars as to the geographical location of Eden, the majority claim that it was in Persia. The Latter-day Saints have more exact knowledge on the matter, a revelation having been given through Joseph Smith at Spring Hill, Missouri. That would be one of the spots that you would visit if you were on Rod Meldrum's tour. On May 19th, 1838, in which that place is named by the Lord as Adam Ondai Amen, because, said he, it is the place where Adam shall come to visit his people, or the Ancient of Days shall sit, as spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Now, there's even a song in Mormon circles. I don't know if some of you former Mormons want to hum it for us. No, you don't have to. But there's a song regarding Adam Ondai Amen. And this place that is thought to be Adam Ondai Amen is owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to this day. I've been there, okay? I've seen this area. I should mention here that notice it says, Adam shall come to visit his people, or the Ancient of Days shall sit. Joseph Smith taught that Adam is the Ancient of Days. And this isn't my own personal opinion on this, but this is my theory as to this might be how Brigham Young came up with the Adam God doctrine. I think what he may have done is combine two schools of thought. One, Joseph Smith's teaching that Adam is the Ancient of Days, and the other school of thought being how most Bible scholars look at the Ancient of Days in the book of Daniel and say that that's another name for God. And maybe, just maybe, Brigham Young takes these two ideas and he conflates them, and this is how he comes up with the Adam God doctrine, not theory, he never called it a theory, but the Adam God doctrine. Could be, I don't know, it's just a thought. But we find that there are a number of places in the Doctrine and Covenants that equates the Ancient of Days with Adam. Now, this is the sign, at least that's what it looked like when I was there the last time. And as I mentioned, it's owned by the LDS Church, and it's north of Gallatin, Missouri, a little town in Missouri. And if you were to go out into that area, you would find a number of signs that support this position. This is known as the Valley of Adam Ondai Amen. In fact, that's what the sign says on there. And the Doctrine and Covenants, section 107 says, in verse 53, 3 years previous to the death of Adam, he called Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalaleel, Jared, Enoch, and Methuselah, who were all high priests, with the residue of his posterity who were righteous, into the valley of Adam Ondai Amen, and there bestowed upon them his last blessing. So what he's doing is he's taking several of these people that are mentioned in the Bible and he's placing them in the Western Hemisphere. And there's no doubting of this. I mean, this is not to be taken as a spiritualization. This is supposed to be actual people in an actual location. If you were to go out to Adam Ondai Amen, you would find that there are a number of signs that tend to verify the things that are written in the Doctrine and Covenants about this area. And for instance, there's this Nephite altar, a Nephite altar that is supposedly was located near a place called Tower Hill. And I'm going to read to you from the history of the church. This is dated Saturday, May 19th, 1838. This morning, we struck our tents and formed a line of march, crossing Grand River at the mouth of Honey Creek and Nelson's Ferry. We pursued our course up the river, mostly through the timber, for about 18 miles when we arrived at Colonel Lyman White's home. Colonel Lyman White was LDS. He lives at the foot of Tower Hill, a name I gave the place in consequence of the remains of an old Nephite altar or tower that stood there, where we camped for the Sabbath. There's a sign out in that area, and you probably already read it there, that talks about this area near Spring Hill. That's in the place called Adamon-Diamond. Now, if there was a Nephite altar there, how would they know that? I mean, Joseph Smith could have gone up to an empty area and just said, well, this is where it was. But no, it seems like at the time, there was actually a pile of rocks out there. And this may have been what inspired Joseph Smith to come up with this. Now, this photograph that you see is found in the book Joseph Smith Begins His Work that was put together by Wilford C. Wood. And they are reproductions of an 1830 Book of Mormon, and then there's another volume that deals with the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants and early articles of faith and such. But he has photographs in there because he went out and visited a lot of these spots. And this is one of the photographs that he has in there. And this is what Orson F. Whitney said. Now, Orson F. Whitney was the son of okay, I'm blanking on the names here. Heber C. Kimball's daughter, Helen Mar Kimball. Okay, Mar Kimball marries a Whitney, and this is their son. Okay, who becomes an apostle. And he says in his book Saturday Night Thoughts, page 46. Adam's altar. In 1838, after the main body of the church had moved to Missouri, the saints built several towns and projected others in Caldwell and other counties of that state. One of those towns was at Spring Hill, Davis County, where the men who made the survey for a new settlement came upon the ruins of an ancient altar situated on a wooded hill overlooking the surrounding country. Straightway they reported to the prophet their interesting find. He, upon beholding it, said to those who were with him, "There is the place where Adam offered up sacrifice after he was cast out of the garden." I mean, this guy just comes up with anything. And you know, he's like the early Paul Dunn of Mormonism. You know, he can say all these amazing things, and people are just mesmerized by what he has to say. Now, we have Joseph Fielding Smith, who, in his book, Doctrine of Salvation, Volume 3, page 238, said that Joseph Smith locates Cumorah in western New York. Oh, and I might mention about those rocks that you saw in that picture, they're not there anymore. I've been out there and I've looked all over that area, and they are not there. And it could be that Latter-day Saints maybe going out there who had known about this probably took them away as souvenirs. I don't know. I have no idea, but those rocks are not there. But anyway, Joseph Fielding Smith said that Joseph Smith locates Cumorah in western New York. Perhaps this matter could rest at this point, but the question of the territory now embraced within the United States, having been in possession of Nephites and Lamanites before the death of Mormon, carries some weight in the determining of this matter. In the light of Revelation, it is absurd for anyone to maintain that the Nephites and Lamanites did not possess this northern land. So again, he's going along with this Heartland model that puts the Book of Mormon lands in the United States area. You have Ezra Taft Benson, 13th president of the church. Consider how very fortunate we are to be living in this land of America. This was the place of three former civilizations, that of Adam, that of the Jaredites, and that of the Nephites. This was also the place where our Heavenly Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, appeared to Joseph Smith, inaugurating the last dispensation. Now, these are some very strong statements and very much believed by the people who spoke them. And I find in talking with some Latter-day Saints, they're very sincere in believing the same things that were taught by the leaders of their past. But the evidence doesn't support this. And I think that's something that we need to challenge our Latter-day Saints on. Why we trust the Bible as opposed to why I have a problem with the Book of Mormon. And I remember having a conversation with a Latter-day Saint on the streets of Manti many years ago. And I was talking to him about some of the struggles that I have with the Book of Mormon and why it's difficult for me to believe this in light of all this evidence that seems to go against it. And I'll never forget him saying, well, he says, well, forget all that. Just pray about it. Well, where do you get that idea? From Moroni 10, right? Well, if all this evidence shows that there's no Book of Mormon, there's no Moroni 10. See, it's kind of putting the cart before the horse here. Demonstrate that I need to believe that Moroni 10 is valid before you tell me to use it as a guide to come up with a conclusion like you've come up with. I can't do that. I just can't do that. And of course, he was having a very difficult time trying to explain to me that even Moroni was a real person. Well, if Moroni wasn't a real person, how do you know he said the things that are in Moroni 10? You see, it doesn't make any sense to me. Well, we have this person here, Mesoamerican archaeologist Dr. Michael Coe. On the back of this room, we have a quotation from Coe, and it's this quotation here. It was from an article that he wrote titled Mormons and Archaeology, An Outside View. Now, Dr. Coe was not LDS, but as an outsider, he had done quite a bit of study on the Book of Mormon and a lot of the theories that are attached to the Book of Mormon. So I would say, based on the things that I've read that he has written, he knew his subject matter. He wasn't just someone that walked off the streets and gave a lot of, uninformed opinions. And I think even the people who put forth Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, which is meant more for intellectual Latter-day Saints. I mean, reading Dialogue, I enjoy reading Dialogue because they're actually quite honest in a lot of these things, because they admit in many of their articles that there is some evidence that's not really exculpatory. It does tend to show a problem here that we need to address. You won't usually find stuff like that in the Liahona or the old Ensign magazines, but this is what he said. The bare facts of the matter are that nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever been shown in any New World excavation which would suggest to a dispassionate observer that the Book of Mormon, as claimed by Joseph Smith, is a historical document relating to the history of early migrants to our hemisphere. This is a man who studied this. He's a Mesoamerican expert. Well, he's passed away since then. Well, this came out in 1973. And as you can imagine, I was getting a lot of mileage out of this quotation. And as the years passed, I was having Latter-day Saints saying, well, Bill, that's such an old quote. Well, just yesterday they found ... fill in the blanks. How many have ever had that experience with some Latter-day Saints? They've always just found something that verifies something that they've not known for years. Well, it was 20 years later, I wrote Dr. Coe asking if he had changed his mind over the past 2 decades, if anything he's come across has tended to change his mind. Well, in 1993, he writes back on a card. I still have the card somewhere in my messy office, where he hand wrote this. He said, "Dear Mr. McKeever," and of course at that point I look around. Is my father around here somewhere? "Dear Mr. McKeever, I haven't changed my views about the Book of Mormon since my 1973 article. I have seen no archaeological evidence before or since that date which would convince me that it is anything but a fanciful creation by an unusually gifted individual living in upstate New York in the early 19th century. That's what he wrote. Now, in 2007, some of you may remember, there was a 2-night special called The Mormons that was aired on local television on PBS. And it was put together by Helen Whitney. And I've often said that I thought Helen Whitney was brilliant in how she made her case. She would interview a number of people on various subjects having to do with Mormonism. But when you see the people being interviewed in this series, she never tells you whether they're LDS or not. So you can't really prejudice your thoughts as you're listening. And if you don't know who they are, and the problem for me was I knew a lot of these people because of what I do, but most people probably wouldn't know. And so they're hearing these people speak and they're trying, I would guess, and this is why I think Whitney did this, you're trying to be as objective as possible listening to what these people have to say. And again, I thought it was brilliant. Well, she had so many interviews, she couldn't fit it in the 2-night special. So there was a website at the time where she had the overflow, you might say, the outtakes, if you will. And included in these was an interview that she had with Michael Coe, which I found fascinating. And in that interview, this is what Dr. Coe said. In the case of the Book of Mormon, you've got a much bigger problem. You really do. We have another part of the world where the archaeology is really very well known now. We know a lot about people like the Maya and their predecessors. So to try to find unlikely evidence in an unlikely spot, you've got a problem. And of course, none of the finds that biblical archaeologists are rightly proud about, no finds on that level have ever come up for Mormon archaeologists, which makes it a big problem. That's a very telling statement. And I would think a lot of your honest apologists would have to agree. He's right. There really isn't anything. And if you want to just prove it, go down to the History Museum. And I know, because I've done this, go ask one of the volunteers there to show you their Nephite artifacts display and watch their face. It's quite interesting. And but I've done this before. They have no Nephite artifacts. Now you would think if they had anything that could be proven to be Nephite, it would be on display. Well, maybe I should take that back because they don't have the seer stone on display. They have a photograph of the seer stone, which always puzzles me. Why can't, it's just a rock for Pete's sake. Put it out there so people can see it. But no, they have a photograph for some reason. I don't understand that. Anyway, 1890, the church is publishing at this time a periodical called the Juvenile Instructor. Now, this was an official monthly church periodical, and it was published between 1901 to 1929, and it targeted, its target audience were children and young people in the LDS church. It would later be replaced by the Instructor. They took out the word juvenile, and that had a run between 1930 and 1970. Well, what were they saying to these young people, because that's who they were targeting in this publication? What were they telling young people about alleged Book of Mormon geography in 1890? Well, George Q. Cannon, who was a member of the First Presidency at the time, had an article in there, and in it he says, "Brethren who lecture on the lands of the Nephites or the geography of the Book of Mormon are not united in their conclusions." Now, as I'm reading this, I'm wondering, wow, that's kind of heavy for kids, isn't it? You know, it's kind of like how the church now came out with a statement on polygamy. And I read it last night, and I'm thinking, this has got to be pretty heavy for kids. You know, God commands Joseph Smith to take on all these wives, and then God changes his mind later on. If I was a kid reading this, man, that would be very confusing, it would seem. But this is what's being said in this publication. They're not united in their conclusions. No two of them, so far as we have learned, are agreed on all points. And in many cases, the variations amount to tens of thousands of miles. These differences of views lead to discussion, contention, and perplexity. And we believe more confusion is caused by these divergencies than good is done by the truths elicited. So basically, they're being warned around the turn of the century here in 1890, be careful about this. If you're going to make these statements, be careful. you probably can't support them with real good solid evidence. This is kind of a warning shot that's being given. Now, it goes on to say, for these reasons, we have strong objections to the introduction of maps and their circulation among our people, which profess to give the location of the Nephite cities and settlements. He argued that they have a tendency to mislead rather than enlighten, and they will lead to division of sentiment and be very unprofitable. We see no necessity for maps of this character because at least much would be left to the imagination of those who prepare them. In other words, there would be bias put into these maps. And everybody seems to agree that's not what you're supposed to do when it comes to maps. You leave your bias out of it, okay? But anyway, much would be left to the imagination of those who prepare them, and we hope that there will be no attempt made to introduce them or give them general circulation. I'm going to give you a little fun homework project. Go home and Google Book of Mormon maps and watch what pops up. Page after page, and website after website of all these maps suggesting various places in the Book of Mormon, listed in the Book of Mormon, and where they are possibly located. One of them we have on the back wall here. This is taken from a church manual, and what's fascinating about it is if you look closely at the map, you'll see there's a lot of places mentioned on it that coincide with places mentioned in the Book of Mormon. But yet at the bottom, with that little red oval there, it says, no effort should be made to identify points on this map with any existing geographical location. So the church produces a map that they tell people not to take seriously. I find that ironic, okay? But it tends to tell us something. This is coming from the church. These are not apologists with their personal opinions. These are not lay members with a strong testimony. This is what the church is telling its people. And do you want me to go back to that one? You want to get a picture of that real quick? Probably a better one, Lee, would be just take that one right there, okay? You have our permission. Let me go on here. The official church position right now is this statement that is found on the churchofjesuschrist.org website. And we have the quote from it on this back site that's just above Dr. Coe's comment. It says, Book of Mormon Geography. The church does not take a position on the specific geographic locations of Book of Mormon events in the ancient Americas. Speculation on the geography of the Book of Mormon may mislead instead of enlighten. That sounds very similar, doesn't it, to what they were saying in 1890? Very similar. And such a study can be a distraction from its divine purpose. Individuals may have their own opinions regarding the Book of Mormon geography and other such matters about which the Lord has not spoken. However, the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 Apostles urge leaders and members not to advocate those personal theories in any setting or manner that would imply either prophetic or church support for those theories. All parties should strive to avoid contention on these matters. So basically, the answer to the question that we raised in the title slide is there is no geography. There is no Book of Mormon geography. If you have no geography, you can't really say that you have archaeology, and even history becomes questionable. You don't know if these people existed because you have no evidence for these people other than a statement by Joseph Smith, who by revelation comes up with this elaborate tale. And that should sadden all of us, because there are a lot of very sincere people that buy into this, yet the evidence doesn't seem to support it. And you've probably heard me say this many times. Faith is believing in something that has not been proven empirically. But to believe in something that's been disproven, and I think a lot of the evidence that is presented by some of these very, very loyal LDS people, a lot of what they've presented has been disproven. But to believe in something that's been disproven is not faith. That's foolish. And I think if we really care about these people, we should try to explain to them why this becomes problematic. And this goes back to the beginning, really, when you think about it, the beginning of the Mormon movement. And it goes back to Joseph Smith, which shows that he is not what he claimed to be, and therefore whatever he says needs to be taken with a big, huge question mark and a lot of challenging questions. In fact, we'll open it for questions now. If you have any on this, I'll try my best. Yes?
Have they done some studies on these proposed sites of whatever in these ruins? Have they done, there's dating methods and things like that? I'm sure they probably spent time trying to come.
Well, they have. In fact, as far as I know, they're not really doing a lot of it now. They do have archaeological teams that are going around trying to find things, but they're not really trying to verify things that are written in the Book of Mormon, for instance. It seems like that heyday is gone, okay? That was a few decades ago they were trying to do that, but nothing came of it. And so they do have archaeologists that are, let's say, over in Israel. And there's one archaeologist out there that was trying to say that there was a find out in Israel, it seems to verify a story in the Book of Mormon, but even that came to nothing. It got a lot of excitement for a while, but then it tends to die down and people don't talk about it anymore because it just wasn't true. So they try, but I'm not seeing any positive results that I would consider to be really faith promoting. But does that help? Anyone else? Yes, Stephen.
Not so much a question as a comment. Being born and raised in the LDS back in South Carolina, and when my dad decided in my teenage years we were going to go on church history trips every summer. And in 1967, we went by the Almond, and we had that little book, a little paperback blue cover, whatever. And it wasn't owned by the church in those days. It said, go down this road, go to that fence, take the fence down and drive. And there was that pile of rocks.
Oh, really? You saw the rocks?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so,
yeah.
Didn't take any of them.
Imagine having that on your bookshelf.
My daddy said, we better not take them. If everybody took one, there wouldn't be any left. And he's right.
So he's had more fulfilled prophecies than Russell Nelson, you could say. All right.
There used to be a sign there that says ancient Lamanite alders.
Yeah.
Yes, and it was still there when we went. Because that's how we knew that was,
Yeah.
the sign.
Yeah. So, yes.
Another thought.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Joseph Smith, it makes you think. You're digging the Zelph thing.
Yeah.
Find the bones. Joseph looks down and says, Lamanite, white, all this. No, it was later. They're walking along. It wasn't then. It was after he had a chance to consider, how am I going to make hay out of this?
Yeah.
So it didn't come in the instant. It's just like the first vision. 12 years later, first instance.
Right. 1832. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, you may have answered this, and I apologize if you did, but with Zelph, the white lamanite, they discovered it as a skeleton, so how do they know what the color of his skin was?
Or he was a big burly man or something like that. Yeah. Well, see, that's the amazement of modern day revelation. You can fill in all those blanks.
Like the skin.
Yeah. He's just spouting off the top of his head, it seems. But yet, look how readily he's believed by these men. They're all writing about it in their journals. And so, you had a question?
Yeah, I've heard that even at the Hillmore and the land that the LDS Church owns in New York, they won't allow any digging or archaeology. Is that something you could confirm?
Well, as far as I know, there hasn't been. Back in the Palmyra Visitor Center, there's nothing on display there either. they don't have anything. And yet we're told these stories of mountains of gold plates that were buried in a cave somewhere. I think Brigham Young may have said something like that. From what I understand, those hills, however, were formed by glaciers. There are no caves in those hills. It's just mounds of dirt that have been moved and rolled over, and there's no holes in them whatsoever. So this whole idea of caves back there, I think would be hard to defend also. But I think the important thing to take away from this is there's just nothing on display, and you would think if they had anything, they would display it. I remember having a conversation with a lady down at Temple Square. We were in the conference center, so we're just north of Temple Square, and we were talking about the gold plates, and she was dismissing this whole idea. Well, it's a good thing that the angel took them back because, we wouldn't want to have them on display. And I went, why not? I would think that would be a real deal breaker for a lot of people. And, well, it'd be so expensive to just guard them. I said, well, with the $1 billion you guys have in accounts, I'm sure you could figure out some way of doing that. And but it didn't bother her at all. But I think if we did have the gold plates, that would be a big deal, but we don't, and neither did he. That's a whole another story. Anyone else? Well, let me pray and we'll dismiss. And if you want to hang around, if you've got some questions, be glad to entertain those. And you don't have to leave, so hang around as long as you like. Father, we thank you for this time. And certainly, Lord, as we examine this history that is so special to members of the LDS Church, it grieves us as Christians when we look at it as outsiders trying to verify some of the things that they've been led to believe. It grieves us that so many do tend to believe it. I pray that maybe somehow we can use this information in a witnessing situation and perhaps put that proverbial pebble in their shoe to start thinking about some of the things that they have been told by their leadership that they trust. And we do pray for the many Latter-day Saints that are having struggles with some of their own history, and we pray that the convicting power of your Holy Spirit will open their eyes to the truth of the New Testament gospel. And again, we thank you for giving us the opportunity to be able to minister in your vineyard, and we give you praise and glory this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thanks for coming. I hope it helped.
Thank you.